Welcome to an intense journey about justice, courage, and difficult choices. Today, we dive into the story of Alyssa Carter, a talented and resilient federal agent dedicated to truth and justice. After months of pursuing a dangerous case, she was simply looking forward to a quiet day, heading home to rest. But on that familiar road, the unexpected happened. A routine traffic stop turned into a nightmare. Officer Derek Holt, with eyes full of hostility and ruthless abuse of power, arrested her unjustly, disregarding the FBI badge in her hand. The tense confrontation between two people representing different sides of the law was not just a test of Alyssa's composure, it was the beginning of a fight for justice against those who misuse authority. Why did Derek target Alyssa? And can she find an ally in a place filled with injustice? Follow this gripping story to discover how Alyssa overcomes unimaginable situations to reclaim her freedom and expose the truth. If you love stories of resilience and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following these meaningful and profound journeys. What would you do if you were in Alyssa's position? Share your thoughts in the comments. Alyssa Carter, a skilled and determined federal agent, was driving her black SUV back to the office after months of hard work on a large-scale drug case. Despite the immense pressure her job placed on her, Alyssa felt a sense of pride knowing that each step forward in the case was a small victory for justice. In a rare moment of solitude in her car, she felt a sense of calm. The soft jazz music playing from her car speakers helped her relax, her eyes glimmering with relief as she thought about a quiet evening with her dog Max and a glass of wine in her favorite armchair. The car glided smoothly through the last intersection before turning onto a quiet street. But then, the red and blue lights flared up behind her, reflecting in her rearview mirror. Alyssa frowned and quickly glanced at her speedometer. It was well within the limit. There were no stop signs and she hadn't committed any traffic violations. A creeping unease stirred in her chest. The police car stayed close behind her, signaling for her to pull over. Alyssa sighed, turned on her blinker, and slowly stopped at the side of the road. Alyssa kept her hands on the steering wheel as she rolled down her window. The breeze carried the scent of hot asphalt into the car. Firm footsteps echoed on the pavement as the officer approached. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark blue uniform. His approach didn't resemble that of someone performing a routine check. It felt more like a soldier preparing for battle. License and registration. His voice was curt, cold, and entirely devoid of professionalism. Alyssa raised her head and kept her gaze steady. "Officer, may I know why I've been pulled over?" she asked, her tone calm and polite. The officer didn't bother looking at her. His face was rigid, his eyes filled with disdain. "Your paperwork," he repeated slowly, as if trying to mask an unspoken anger. Alyssa inhaled deeply to steady herself. She reached into the side compartment, retrieved her FBI badge, and held it up at eye level. "I'm Special Agent Alyssa Carter, returning from official duty. I don't believe I've broken any laws." Her voice remained composed, though the growing tension made her feel uneasy. She had encountered difficult officers before, but something about this man's demeanor felt far more dangerous. The officer's eyes briefly flicked over the badge, but instead of showing respect or understanding, he sneered. "I don't care who you are. I asked for your license and registration." The air around them seemed to grow heavier. Alyssa could feel the distant stares of a few bystanders who had paused to watch. She knew that even if she complied with every request, the situation could still spiral out of control. She opened the glove compartment, retrieved her driver's license and registration, and handed them over. But instead of taking the documents, the officer stepped back, placed his hand on his holster, and pointed to the door. "Step out of the vehicle immediately." Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest. This was the sign of a situation dangerously out of control. "Officer, I've complied with your request. I have the right to know why." "Out, now!" the officer yelled, his face flushed with anger, as though something inside him had snapped. Alyssa felt a chill spread through her body, but she knew she couldn't react impulsively. She slowly opened the car door and stepped out, her hands raised to show she wasn't carrying a weapon. But as soon as her feet touched the ground, the officer suddenly grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. "What are you doing?" Alyssa shouted, her voice filled with anger and disbelief. "You think you can ignore my orders?" The cold click of the handcuffs echoed as the metal locked around her wrists. A small crowd began to gather nearby, whispering in shock. Some raised their phones to record the scene. Alyssa clenched her teeth, fighting back her fury. The pressure of the metal against her skin was cold and merciless. For the first time in her career, she was being treated like a criminal, in the middle of the street, under the watchful eyes of strangers. The patrol car sped down the empty road, sirens blaring through the silent surroundings. Alyssa Carter sat in the back seat, her wrists locked tightly in cold handcuffs. She forced herself to sit upright, her gaze steady, though inside her, a fire of indignation burned fiercely. As a federal agent with over 10 years of experience, Alyssa was no stranger to stories of abuse of power and discrimination, but she had never imagined herself becoming the central figure in such a story. On the way, she watched through the window, memorizing the route. The streets outside became more desolate, the buildings replaced by empty lots and old warehouses. She realized that this wasn't the route to the downtown police station. It led to a remote, isolated area on the outskirts of town. Officer Derek Holt sat in the driver's seat, his cold eyes occasionally glancing at her through the rearview mirror. There was no explanation, no questioning, just an unsettling silence and the hum of the engine. Alyssa kept her voice calm, even as anger pulsed through her veins with each heartbeat. "Officer Holt, I have the right to know why I'm being detained," she said, her eyes fixed on his reflection in the mirror. Derek smirked slightly but didn't turn around. "You think that shiny badge of yours means you can do whatever you want?" His voice was low, dripping with contempt. "That's not the answer I'm asking for," Alyssa emphasized, striving to keep her voice steady. Derek gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Do you know what it feels like," he growled, "to deal with people every day who think they're better than you? Think that just because they carry a badge, they have the right to do whatever they want?" Alyssa could sense something deeper than anger, something that had festered for a long time: hatred and envy. The car finally turned down a narrow road and stopped in front of a small, gray brick building that looked old and isolated compared to the modern downtown precinct she was used to. The sign that read Westbridge Police Station was faded and looked like it hadn't been replaced in years. Derek got out of the car, opened the back door, and yanked Alyssa out roughly. "Easy," Alyssa muttered, but Derek didn't respond. He simply dragged her across the parking lot as if she were a dangerous criminal. The heavy metal door of the station slammed shut behind them with a foreboding clang. The air inside was cold and eerily quiet. A few officers sat idly at the front desk, barely glancing up as Derek led Alyssa past them. Everything was too silent, too familiar. Alyssa realized that this was the kind of place where wrongdoing could easily be hidden. Derek shoved Alyssa into a small room that contained only an old metal table and 2 chairs. The gray walls were peeling, and the flickering fluorescent light overhead made the space feel even more oppressive. Alyssa sat down on the cold chair, forcing herself to remain composed. Derek circled her like a predator waiting for the right moment to pounce. "Listen up, Agent Carter," Derek said, his gaze sharp as a blade. "There's no backup for you here, no supervisor to protect you, just me." Alyssa met his gaze without flinching. "And I have the law on my side." Derek let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You think the law will save you? I am the law here." Alyssa felt the weight of Derek's words. He was playing a game of power, trying to intimidate her and break her resolve. But what Derek didn't know was that Alyssa had survived far worse situations. She took a deep breath, keeping her voice low and steady. "You're making a big mistake, Officer Holt. Stop now before this goes too far." Derek leaned in closer, his voice low and dripping with sarcasm. "You don't know anything about me, Agent Carter, but you will soon." Alyssa stared into Derek's eyes, her mind racing. There's more to this than just an unjust traffic stop. What is he hiding? Alyssa sat alone in the cold room, the flickering fluorescent light casting a dim glow over her calm, yet resolute face. The metal table in front of her faintly reflected the image of her cuffed hands. Questions swirled endlessly in Alyssa's mind like a never-ending loop. She recalled Derek Holt's defiant glare and harsh words. This wasn't a routine situation. Derek was deliberately flexing his authority. It was as clear as the light above her, flickering but enough to illuminate the truth. She tried to steady herself. She was a federal agent with years of experience, having faced dangers far greater than this. But the feeling of being restrained, treated like a criminal in front of the apathetic stares of the other officers, made her pride burn like fire. The door to the interrogation room suddenly creaked open, the hinges letting out a long, grating sound. Derek Holt entered, his hand resting casually on his hip as if to assert his dominance. "Welcome to reality, Agent Carter," Derek sneered, his voice laced with mockery. Alyssa's gaze remained calm, refusing to let anger cloud her judgment. "You're breaking the law, Officer Holt," she said, her voice cold yet steady. "This arrest is illegal, and you know it." Derek stepped closer, placing both hands on the cold metal table. The distance between them shrank to mere inches. "The law?" Derek whispered, a smirk twisting his lips. "You think that shiny badge of yours will protect you forever? Here, I am the law." Alyssa stayed silent, her eyes locked on Derek's, as if trying to see past the wall of bravado he'd built around himself. Through the small window on the door, Alyssa saw two other officers walk by. They glanced briefly into the room, but then quickly looked away as if this were just another ordinary day at work. That was the most frightening part. They were so used to things like this that they felt nothing. Alyssa realized that Derek Holt wasn't the only one abusing power here. Every silent witness who turned away was complicit. "You know I'm innocent," Alyssa said, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "You know it, yet you're still doing this. Why?" Derek straightened up, his eyes flashing with a cold, unreadable glint. "You have no idea what's really going on, Carter, and I don't owe you any explanations." Derek turned and walked out of the room, leaving Alyssa alone in the heavy silence. She scanned the room, searching for anything that might help her escape. On the wall was a small security camera, rotating slowly. Was it actually recording, or was it just another useless display meant to give the illusion of oversight? Alyssa shifted her hands, testing the handcuffs. They were tight, but not unbearably so. A few minutes later, the door opened again. This time, a different officer entered, a younger man, tall and thin, with a face that betrayed his nervousness. His name tag read, Ryan Moore. Ryan stepped toward the table and placed a form and a pen in front of Alyssa. "I need you to fill out this form," he said, his voice soft but clear. Alyssa looked directly at him, her eyes scrutinizing. "Do you also think I'm a criminal?" Ryan lowered his gaze and didn't answer immediately. His hands trembled slightly as he opened a small notebook, as if afraid of an unseen pair of eyes watching his every move. "I'm just following orders," Ryan mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Alyssa gave a faint, humorless smile. "Following orders doesn't make it right. You know that." Ryan froze, his eyes blinking, as if her words had struck a nerve deep within him. There was a brief silence between them, and Alyssa realized that Ryan wasn't like Derek. He didn't completely agree with what was happening. There was a flicker of conscience in his eyes. Small, but it was there. "You can help me," Alyssa said, her voice soft yet firm, almost like a whisper carrying the weight of truth. "You know this is wrong. If you stay silent, you're just another part of the injustice." Ryan glanced at the door behind him, as though expecting someone to walk in at any second. She could see the turmoil in his eyes, the battle between fear and conscience. I can't," Ryan stammered, shaking his head as if trying to shake off the pressure. Alyssa's gaze remained steady, refusing to let him escape the moment. "You can," she insisted. "You're the only one in this room who has the chance to do the right thing." Ryan pressed his lips together, his shoulders slumping as though he were carrying an invisible weight. Before he could say anything more, the door to the room flew open again. Derek Holt stormed in, his eyes blazing with fury. "What's taking so long, Moore?" Derek barked. "She's just a criminal, not a puzzle for you to solve." Ryan jolted upright, fumbling as he shoved his notebook back into his pocket. "Sorry, officer," Ryan mumbled, avoiding Derek's glare. Alyssa's eyes stayed locked on Ryan as he left the room with Derek. Just before the door closed, she whispered, "Remember, you have a choice." The door slammed shut, leaving Alyssa alone in the cold room. But this time, she felt a glimmer of hope piercing through the darkness. The cell door closed with a harsh clang, amplifying the suffocating atmosphere in the room. Alyssa sat down on the worn wooden chair inside the holding cell. The small room contained only a basic metal bed frame and a dim yellow light casting a weak glow from the ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rust, as though the entire room had been abandoned for years. She sat upright, forcing her breathing to remain steady. But deep inside, anger and humiliation swirled in her chest like a storm. She wasn't a criminal. She was a federal agent, someone who had devoted her life to fighting for justice. Yet here she was, treated like someone with no right to speak or defend herself. Footsteps echoed from the distance, causing Alyssa to look up. Someone was approaching. Her heartbeat quickened, but she remained composed. The holding cell door opened, and Ryan Moore stepped inside. He stood by the doorway, partially illuminated by the faint light. He looked even more nervous than during their last encounter. Alyssa wasn't surprised. She knew the immense pressure he was under. This isn't right," Ryan said softly, his voice strained as though he didn't want to hear the words himself. Alyssa looked up, her eyes gleaming with a flicker of hope. "At last you've admitted it," she said gently, making sure her tone carried no hint of blame. "I knew you weren't like them." Ryan exhaled deeply and stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. He hesitated for a moment before dragging an old chair closer and sitting across from her. "Officer Derek, he's always been like this," Ryan admitted, his voice low and heavy with guilt. "I've seen this happen so many times, but I always stayed silent. I didn't know what to do." "You know what you need to do," Alyssa replied, locking eyes with him. "You just need to decide whether to stand up or keep your head down." Ryan clenched his hands together tightly, as though trying to suppress his fear. "He's my superior officer. If I go against him, my career will be over. Maybe even my life," Ryan murmured, his voice cracking. Alyssa leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but resolute. "Ryan, if you do nothing, I won't just lose my freedom, I'll lose my dignity and my belief in justice. But more importantly, you'll lose yourself. You'll carry the weight of regret and fear, knowing that you stayed silent when you had the chance to act." Ryan lifted his eyes to meet hers, and for a moment she saw a flash of emotion, something raw and genuine, but it was quickly swallowed by fear. A heavy silence filled the room. Alyssa could sense the inner battle raging inside Ryan, a war between duty, fear, and his conscience. "I can't promise anything," Ryan whispered after a few moments of quiet, "but I'll think about it." Alyssa nodded slightly, understanding that it was the best she could hope for at that moment. Ryan stood up and walked toward the cell door. But before he opened it, Alyssa called out, "Ryan ... He paused and turned to face her. "Whatever you decide," Alyssa said sincerely, "I still believe you're a good person." Ryan gave a faint smile, but it quickly faded. He opened the door and stepped out, the sound of it closing behind him reverberating down the hallway. Alyssa sat down on the bed, trying to stay calm despite the oppressive atmosphere. The seconds ticked by slowly, stretching out like hours. She thought of her colleagues back at the federal office. They would surely be worried when she failed to check in. Would they come looking for her? She shook her head, reminding herself that she couldn't rely on luck. This time she had to find a way out of this dangerous situation on her own. And she knew that Ryan Moore was the only key to her escape. Ryan Moore walked slowly down the hallway, each step feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. A cold draft blew in from the window at the end of the corridor, making him shiver slightly. But the chill outside wasn't as terrifying as the coldness within him, the inner turmoil between his conscience and fear. If he spoke up, everything could collapse. If he stayed silent, everything inside him would die. He recalled the hopeful look in Alyssa Carter's eyes, steadfast yet unable to hide the pain of enduring humiliation and injustice. Her words echoed in his mind. "If you do nothing, you'll lose yourself." Ryan stopped walking and leaned against the wall to steady his breath. His heart pounded, not from exertion, but from the crushing weight of an invisible fear tightening around his thoughts. He closed his eyes and memories flooded back like an unrelenting torrent. Images of Derek Holt's abuses of power flashed through his mind like a slow-motion film. A man with sun-weathered skin, handcuffed just for asking why he had been stopped. A woman yelled at as she tried to shield her young son from Derek's threats. And Ryan standing there, watching it all happen, too afraid to do anything but keep his head down and stay silent. Each time, he had told himself, "There's nothing I can do. I'm just a junior officer. If I speak out, I'll be thrown out, retaliated against, and ruined. But this time it was different. Alyssa Carter wasn't like the others he had seen. She didn't scream, didn't beg, but every word she spoke was an undeniable truth. You're the only one in this room who has the chance to do the right thing. Ryan opened his eyes, feeling the tension spread through his body like a live wire. He knew Alyssa was right, but he also knew Derek wouldn't forgive him if he sided with her. Derek Holt wasn't just a man with a temper. He had enough power and influence to destroy a young officer like Ryan completely. Ryan walked toward the front desk, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He needed to think clearly. What now? Which path should he choose? He asked himself what would happen if he had the courage to stand up. He'd lose his job, be watched, and possibly be targeted for revenge. Alyssa would get out, expose the corruption, and fight back, but he would be the first to suffer the fallout. In the quiet room, he stared at the blank white wall. His mind was torn by two opposing voices. Stay silent. No one will blame you if you stay silent. You're just protecting yourself. You've seen enough. You have the chance to save an innocent person. If you do nothing, you'll never look at yourself in the mirror without feeling disgusted. Ryan's trembling hand reached up to rub his face. He felt as though every invisible eye in the station was watching him. Alyssa's words echoed again in his mind. You'll lose yourself. Suddenly, strong footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway. Ryan turned and saw Derek Holt striding toward him with a scowl on his face. Derek barked a question at another officer, throwing a suspicious glance in Ryan's direction. A shiver ran down Ryan's spine. He knew Derek was starting to suspect him. More! Derek's voice boomed. What are you doing here? Why haven't you finished processing her? Ryan turned, his face worried, but his voice as calm as he could manage. I'm double-checking the procedures to make sure I don't make a mistake. Derek's lip curled in a disdainful smirk. Stop pretending to be a professional more. No one here cares about procedures. Just remember, she's nothing. Ryan clenched his jaw, trying to suppress the anger bubbling in his chest. It was the final straw. As Derek turned and walked away, Ryan stared at his broad frame disappearing down the hallway. He knew Derek wouldn't stop. If Ryan didn't act, Alyssa would remain a victim in Derek's cruel power play. Ryan took a deep breath and headed toward the staircase that led down to the holding cells. His heart pounded in his chest. But this time, every step he took carried not hesitation, but resolve. He had made his choice. Alyssa sat on the old metal bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling where the dim, flickering light cast shifting shadows. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow, deliberate, but steady. She immediately stood up, her eyes sharp with vigilance. The heavy iron door creaked open again, and this time it was Ryan Moore, without the hesitation she'd seen before. Ryan? Alyssa called softly, her voice filled with both doubt and hope. Ryan stepped in, quickly locking the door behind him. He looked at her with a determination that was new and unwavering. I can't stay silent anymore, he said firmly. We need to get out of here before Derek realizes. Alyssa stared at him for a long moment before nodding. Are you sure about this? More sure than I've ever been. Ryan pulled the handcuff key from his belt and swiftly unlocked Alyssa's cuffs. She rubbed her wrists, the red marks still visible, but inside her a fire blazed, not of anger, but of resolve to reclaim justice. Ryan led Alyssa down the empty corridor. The alarm hadn't sounded yet, but that could change in an instant if they were discovered. We'll head out through the back exit. My car's parked nearby, Ryan whispered, his eyes darting around to make sure the coast was clear. Alyssa nodded, keeping her footsteps as light as possible. They passed the front desk without encountering anyone, a rare but unsettling stroke of luck. Just as they reached the emergency exit, a loud voice bellowed, "Stop right there!" Alyssa and Ryan spun around. Derek Holt was at the far end of the hallway, his gun drawn, face flushed red with fury. "You dare betray me, Moore?" Derek roared. "You have no idea what you're doing." Ryan stepped in front of Alyssa protectively, raising his hands. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Ryan replied, his voice steady. "I can't keep siding with what's wrong." Derek snarled like a cornered beast. "Neither of you is leaving here alive." Alyssa seized the moment while Derek was distracted. She lunged toward him, using a trained wrist lock technique to strike his gun hand. The weapon clattered to the floor with a metallic clang, sliding several feet away. Derek shouted in rage and swung a punch at Alyssa, but she dodged it, countering with a solid strike to his jaw. Derek staggered but didn't go down. Ryan rushed in to help Alyssa, but Derek was stronger than he'd expected. Derek rammed his shoulder into Ryan, knocking him to the ground. Alyssa swept her leg, causing Derek to lose balance. She dove for the fallen gun and aimed it directly at him. "Derek, stand down!" she shouted. "Don't make me do this!" Derek glared at her, his breath ragged like a wild animal's. But in his eyes there was a flicker of fear, the realization that he was losing. Suddenly the station's alarm blared, echoing through the halls, signaling that reinforcements were being deployed. Alyssa knew their time was running out. "Go!" Ryan yelled. Alyssa backed toward the door, keeping her gun trained on Derek as Ryan pulled it open. They sprinted outside, and the cool night air hit Alyssa's face like a jolt of clarity. They jumped into Ryan's car. The engine roared as Ryan floored the accelerator, and the car sped out of the parking lot. "Where are we heading?" Alyssa asked, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "There's a safe house a few miles from here," Ryan replied, his grip on the wheel tight. "You can contact your team from there." Just as Alyssa feared, flashing police lights appeared behind them. Derek and his men were in pursuit. "We have to lose them," Ryan said. The car flew down deserted streets, Ryan maneuvering with surprising skill, but Derek stayed on their tail like a relentless shadow. Alyssa opened the glove compartment and found a toolkit. She grabbed a small metal rod and said, "Hold the wheel steady." Ryan nodded as Alyssa leaned down and hurled the rod at the pursuing car's front tire. A sharp screech filled the air as Derek's car skidded, veering off the road and crashing into a metal barrier with a violent crunch. Up ahead, red and blue lights flashed. FBI reinforcements had arrived. Alyssa exhaled in relief as she recognized the lead vehicle. Her supervisor, Marcus Hale, was at the front. Ryan slammed on the brakes, pulling over as the other cars surrounded them. Alyssa stepped out, her gun still in her hand but with a newfound sense of relief. Marcus ran over, his face filled with concern. "Carter, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Alyssa nodded, her expression resolute. "But we need to arrest Derek Holt immediately." Derek was pulled from his car, blood trickling down his forehead, his wrists now locked in handcuffs. He continued to snarl and mutter, but he was powerless. Alyssa stood still, watching as Derek was taken away without a shred of regret on his face. She knew this wasn't over, but at least this battle had been won. Ryan stood beside her, his face a mixture of emotion and relief. "You believed in me? Did I do the right thing?" he asked quietly. Alyssa turned to him and nodded. "You did. You did the right thing." Alyssa was taken back to the federal office to file a report, while Derek Holt faced a long list of serious charges. The incident triggered a full-scale investigation into the entire Westbridge Police Department. In the end, Alyssa understood that justice wasn't just upheld by the strength of a federal badge. It came from people who had the courage to stand against what was wrong, people like Ryan Moore. She smiled as she walked out of the office, knowing she hadn't fought this fight alone. The story of one person's courage had ignited a beacon of light in the darkest depths of injustice, and the fight for justice would never end.